Welcome to Women Who Fights podcast. We empower female fighters to take full agency over their training. Our goal is to celebrate and inspire others with the incredible action women and allies are taking to level the playing field. We talk to experts, uncover prejudice, and champion what's driving our progress.
And today we have with us Olivia Qasir, who is a 27-year-old filmmaker based in Lahore in Pakistan. And being of a mixed British-Pakistani heritage, her early schooling was in Lahore, after which she moved to London to study at SOAS and then King's College. After her master's, Olivia took a short documentary course at City Academy with the intention to document the women's movement in Pakistan. So, Olivia, thank you for coming.
Thank you so much for having me.
Tell us, growing up in Pakistan and then moving to the UK for your higher education, and now having moved back to Pakistan, what is your relationship with your country and your culture?
Well, I think if you ask any feminist living in Pakistan what their relationship is like with their country and their culture, you're never going to get one sort of smooth sailing answer. It's quite conflicted because while we have a really rich, beautiful cultural history, which women have contributed to, we also have a sort of state apparatus which upholds sort of very patriarchal structures that have, for many years excluded and oppressed women. And this is very true since the 80s, when we had a military dictatorship and they sort of injected very conservative sort of forms of Islam and patriarchal structures into the fabric of our society. And that's been very difficult to kind of unweave. And it has definitely affected women. So for me, growing up as a young girl, I always knew that something was off. I didn't know how to express it. I didn't possess the vocabulary or the sort of feminist knowledge or understanding. So, but at the same time, things didn't sit well with me. And then I moved to London at the sort of tender age of 16. And I was kind of sort of seduced by this more liberal life where I could go wherever I wanted to and dress however I wanted. And that made me feel culturally and therefore emotionally quite distant from where I came from. So, yeah, I mean, that's how it was until a few years ago. And then about 5 or 6 years ago, some like women's groups and other organizations started popping up. And that kind of like drew my attention. And a lot of my friends back home in Pakistan were, a part of them. This was, all female comedy troupes and annual female bike rallies. I mean, this is a whole other story where women in Pakistan it's culturally frowned upon for them to ride bikes. And it's a whole thing about, opening your legs and riding in that kind of straddling position. And this was never the case in my grandmother's lifetime, by the way. She used to be able to ride her bike to college, and that stopped after the 80s, and that kind of like conservative way of life took over. So a few years ago, sorry, I'm going to go back to the main point. A few years ago, a young girl actually decided to ride a bike and she got knocked over by a man in a car on purpose and she got really badly injured. And so thereafter, women have been gathering, in their hundreds to stage an annual bike rally. So I know it's so shocking. I can't even. So this stuff like this made me feel like, oh, women are doing something about, what I always felt was so wrong in our society. Women are getting together, and that kind of drew me back. And then, of course, the Aurat March itself, the Women's March, when I heard about that, that was a total breath of fresh air for me. And something that I kind of thirsted for and craved as a little girl And I didn't even realize how much it meant to me until I actually saw it. So that has made me feel much more. These sorts of women's groups have made me feel much more connected to my roots, and I'm so much happier to be back now. I mean, I'm happy to be back, and it's just really nice being connected to this beautiful resource and network of women who are doing something about things that bothered me so much as a child.
I mean, that's amazing that it's all changed since the 80s. So I'm really so before the 80s was much more liberal. So the 80s was when stricter sort of attitudes were brought in. What was that found? What was the sort of the reasoning that it was? What was their argument for doing that to make people then follow it?
We had a military regime under General Zia, and in order for him to stay in power, he used Islamization as an excuse. And he said, I'll only hold elections once, we've properly Islamized this country. And so that gave him full reign to sort of govern Pakistan up until 88 when he died. So the process of that had huge repercussions for women and for minority groups, and their representation and their access to various rights. And so something like that, his reforms really sort of changed our society and took it sort of backwards. Or I wouldn't even say backwards, because before then things were okay. But he just took it into a whole different direction, and it's been very difficult to kind of unpick that and reverse that.
Yeah, absolutely. So you made a documentary for Vice, which was a really big deal, and it caught a lot of attention. What was the response, the general public response of people around you, and also internationally?
Well, I think from the women's groups that I'm in touch with, it was overwhelmingly positive, which I'm really happy about, because I mean, they're the main people I care about the most. And so I'm very happy to say that they liked it. And in terms of the general public, Vice's outreach doesn't really go towards, the average Pakistani person. So, people who subscribe to Vice documentaries are normally sort of young, international, woke, student-y kind of people who generally believe that women should have rights. So I don't know if it actually has even reached the general public. What I can say is that my film has been restricted on YouTube. If you try and watch it, it asks you to press confirm about 6 or 7 times. And that is the result of people reporting it. And I assume it was sort of men, because, they deem it sort of offensive and indecent content, which is quite laughable, because it's just talking about women's rights. But what I'm happy about is that in the comments section, so many people are sort of like in uproar and saying, why is it so difficult to access this film, which is talking about women's rights in Pakistan? And look what other filth there is out there on the internet. So, I'm very disappointed in YouTube, not fully surprised or anything that YouTube would cater to, a bunch of incels. But yeah, there you go. So generally speaking, the average Pakistani person hasn't actually watched this film. And so I haven't faced any sort of backlash as such, which, is fine. I made it for the women out there, really.
And for people who might not have seen it, can you just give a little outline, a bit of background as to your process of going to film it, why you filmed it, and what actually what you just sort of discovered in the process?
Yeah, sure. So while I was doing my master's, I was just finishing up with my master's in 2019, and I was in London. And at the same time, the Aurat March, the second Aurat March, had just taken place in Lahore and actually in other cities as well. And it was so exciting because, compared to the first Aurat March, the number of attendees had almost doubled in size, and it was so much more intersectional. And it reverberated throughout society, and it got a lot of coverage. And alongside this coverage, there was also a tremendous amount of backlash from online trolls, from the media, from certain politicians who said that it was going against Pakistan's Islamic values, and it was going against the what South Asian women, their general roles are, and how and how it was considered vulgar and indecent. And so there was a whole onslaught against these women, and they received rape and death threats, the organizers. And I just thought, oh my God, something very unique in Pakistan's women's history is happening at the moment. And it's causing reverberations, and people are speaking about issues that were never even spoken about before, and it's also exposing a lot of misogyny, just because of the backlash that we saw. You can actually then see it; it's surface level. And so I thought, who's documenting this? And I also felt, immense FOMO, because I thought, where am I? What am I doing over here writing my essay when something actually is going on? And so then I decided to do a lot of research, talk to these women. My best friend was an integral part of the Aurat March, and she also features in the film. Her name is Yusra. She's the poet who did that. A happy woman is always a lucky woman. So she got me in touch with a lot of women out here. And then I did that short documentary course. I came over here. I started fundraising, and that was really, really difficult. No one wants to give, money to someone who's just starting off and who just has this idea of making a documentary. So no one took me seriously. But nonetheless, I had a friend who helped me create this 2-minute trailer of the few interviews that I had done on a very small budget. And that 2-minute trailer was then shared by that wonderful digital artist, Shazil Malik, on her social media. And then someone from Vice said, this is exactly what we're looking for. So that was a huge sigh of relief for me, because I really felt like, okay, is this even working? What am I even doing? No one trusts me. What's going on? Have I made a big life mistake? I work in an office somewhere. So yeah, that was a huge sigh of relief. And anyway, yeah, I was, in good hands thereafter. And I had a wonderful producer who shared the same values as I did, the same politics. And so she was very happy with what I wanted to add and take away in the content and in the editing process. So, yeah.
Wow.
Amazing.
And can we clear out for the audience, what are the issues that women are facing in Pakistan? So, especially for us living here and thinking, oh, we are free, what's happening there?
Well, my film covers just a number of some of the issues that women in Pakistan face. In it, it'll say that Pakistan is the 6th most dangerous country in the world for women. That's not too far off from the US, which is at number 10, I have to say. And I guess that's very telling of the different forms patriarchy manifests itself into. There's the Eastern one, there's a Western one, and how different are they really? But, in terms of Pakistan, we look at, the film looks at acid attacks and just how common that is in South Asia. not just Pakistan, in India and in Bangladesh as well, where women who refuse to marry a man, or women who refuse a man's advances, or a woman who seeks to divorce her husband, it is so common for them to become victims of acid attacks, because acid is very easily available over here, and its sale isn't even regulated because it has other uses. But so that's a very common phenomenon over here. It's extremely tragic, and it's kind of, if I ask any Pakistani female friend of mine, what's your biggest fear as a woman, they'll all say having acid thrown at me. And which is I mean, it's my biggest fear as well, but it's not as common amongst sort of the more privileged segments of society. This happens, in kind of more working class communities. But nonetheless, it's so prevalent that, acid attack victims serve as some sort of bogeyman for women in Pakistan. We think that could be me. And so, I mean, there's that. And then there's also, sorry, I've gone blank. Oh, we've got child marriages. Women under the age of 18 are married off in their millions every year. And we had a minister of the National Assembly only, I don't know, a few weeks ago, a man in his 50s, married a 14-year-old girl, even though in this country you have to be at least 16 to be married. So, men thwart the law over here, men in power, and get away with it almost.
Wow.
And that leads to all sorts of other abuses, child marriages itself, that means early onset pregnancies, which leads to all sorts of complications, domestic violence, economic abuse. So, and then of course we have honor killings. And that's also spoken briefly about in the film, where, again, in South Asia, a woman's body sort of embodies the family's honor. And so, if she marries a man of her own choosing that the family may not approve of, or if she has extramarital sex, premarital sex, any form of what is considered to be adultery, or even if she's raped, actually, the family honor is seen as being sullied in some way and tainted. And, it's quite common for family members, even mothers, to murder their own child just to protect the honor of the family. So, I mean, these are just some of the, most sort of awful parts of what it's like to be a woman in Pakistan. And then, these are just kind of like the worst bits. But then there are just like everyday, atrocities that are committed, against women. Women sort of being married off to men they don't want to marry, even if they're over a certain age. Working class women out here, they have zero autonomy over their lives, and the gender wage gap is more than double of the global average out here. So how one can expect a woman to be economically independent and therefore her own person is something that's impossible out here, at least for certain women in certain segments of society. But the higher up you go in terms of class, women, even they have their own struggles that are very particular to Pakistan. For example, I'll give you an example of what happened to me. I went on a walk with my mom. This was at the heart of the first lockdown, when the whole world was, completely. And the only forms of entertainment I had were socially distanced walks with some friends. And I got quite used to that, knowing that, I have to be slightly on my guard because, there is street harassment out here. And And but then I got quite comfortable because nothing had happened to me so far, and I live in a sort of what is considered to be a safe neighborhood. And then, before I knew it, some man on a motorbike came and swerved really close to me and very aggressively groped me and then sped off. And he had a helmet on, and it just made me feel like, well, first of all, terrible. I was assaulted, but also I felt sort of, I should have known. That was one of the feelings I had. Like, I should have known. What was I doing? Why did I think that I had the right, almost? And that's what that man wanted to do. He wanted to teach me a lesson and say, who do you think you are, roaming around without a male companion, without your protector? And so these are some of the everyday things that Pakistani women face. And at the same time, this kind of reminds you of what happened to that poor woman, Sarah Everard. And it's opened up some dialogue about
and many
how safe
others.
it is. Yeah,
many others. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
I think was awful. That feeling of that powerlessness and sort of dirty and just like, like I didn't like that. It's such a unique, horrible feeling being sexually assaulted. And it's all that it's it just makes you want to like scream.
Yeah.
Is there any support from the police? For example, for the acid attacks, would the police do anything to like arrest a man for that?
Yeah, I mean, so the two women I spoke to who were victims, survivors of acid attacks, they both their husbands have been locked away. There are women's groups.
Their husbands did it.
Oh yeah, yes, their husbands. Yeah. I mean, it's bizarre. It's so common. So this woman, the woman who appears in the documentary, her husband did it because she was seeking a divorce from him, and he couldn't take that. And he was a ne'er-do-well, and he would beat her every single day. And that's why she was trying to get away from him. He wasn't even sort of providing for her and her daughters, and that's why she thought, this is it. And then he couldn't take that, and so that's what he had to do. I feel like we should have a sort of trigger warning for people viewing this, because it's just it's so tragic.
We can definitely put that in, because this is very. I feel like it's one of those things that we in the UK. I've lived in the UK my entire life, and my experience of a sort of sexual assault and the feeling like powerless against certain things, definitely there.
Yeah.
But then it's like talking to you and about your experiences in Pakistan. You're like, wow, like there really is a huge breadth. I mean, I'm aware of this, but it's very different when you really get into the nitty gritty and you really talk about like your personal experience and exactly what is going on. And you're aware that like that feeling of right now, some women are being sexually assaulted, like right now, at this very moment. And it's not like a theoretical or a sort of an imagined thing which is sort of happens out there. It's happening now. And that is a very, very real, and sort of you can really, it's very scary. I find it really scary, which I'm sure like we all do. I mean, this whole Sarah thing is it's absolutely awful. But I wonder about what's the situation for women in education in Pakistan? What's their access? Because a lot of, not that it is a controlling factor, but it's definitely a factor in liberation, is being aware of your place and the agency you should have, and sort of learning about history. And I mean, it seems so recent, the 80s, that was when the military occupation was, and it's only been 40 years and it's so entrenched. And this could happen anywhere in the world. Like it doesn't take much for things to suddenly revert. So but yeah, I've forgotten my question now.
Education.
Yeah, that one.
Yeah. Well, I guess in terms of access to education, it really depends on, what class you're from again. But the average Pakistani woman will be from a low income household. And that means that her right to education, it will always be superseded by, say, her brother's right. If a poor family has to send one of their kids to school, it's going to be the boy, it's not going to be the girl. So, by the 6th grade, there are 59% of girls are taken out of school. By the 9th grade, you'll only see 13% of girls attending. That's a very, very, very low rate. And so I absolutely, I agree with you. Access to education is empowering. Being literate, really takes you out of, your situation and makes you understand the world. And, just to be able to read a sign that, it's very, very frightening and disempowering if you can't do that in a world that's, it's all about, being literate. But yeah, so in terms of access to education, there's a huge illiteracy problem in Pakistan, but women are disproportionately more affected, for sure.
Mm-hmm. And what does that mean for social media access and access to news if you can't read? Do women sort of having a phone, for example, is that normal, common for women?
Yes. So I think a lot of urban women over here, if they're working class, they have to get around and they have to, speak to their employees who, everyone is expected to have a phone here. A lot of them still don't have smartphones. So, a lot of them are still, those little Nokia type phones that we used to have. And I've noticed that, working class men in the family, if anyone is to have a smartphone, it will be working class men, not their wives or their daughters or their sisters. They'll have the cheaper, smaller phone. So I don't know what access to information is like. I mean, I think in urban communities, they can share a TV, and that's where you get access from in terms of news and stuff. But in general, I can't really imagine women being able to engage with what's going on over here and with the outside world politically. Having said that, I think a lot of women are becoming slightly more aware of the political situation just because of the austerity measures over here in this country that have, really, really disenfranchised working class people. It's made, so many, goods, like food and basic things so unaffordable that people are kind of thinking, what's going on, but how to actually channel that anger and how to understand what's going on is something that, I can't really answer. I don't know enough.
Mm-hmm. And maybe this is a way of controlling the crowd as well. If they are not educated, how could they seek anything better than what you have offered them?
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, completely. Yeah.
Could you talk to us? Could you talk to us a little bit about trans women? Because it is a Muslim country. So how do they? What's their stance in trans women?
So in the documentary, the trans woman that I interviewed, Jannat, she talks about this British Colonial Act of 1871 that came about, that was implemented by the British when they came to colonize the whole of the subcontinent. And what this did was it criminalized being trans. And it also criminalized sex work, actually. So trans women beforehand, I think transgender people in general, they had a much more sort of respected role in society. They were more visible. There were some, prominent trans women who, were resided in the Mughal courts. And that all was changed and criminalized back in, the 19th century when the British came and they injected their own notions of Victorian conservative heteronormativity that, South Asian societies weren't necessarily very strict. They were much more fluid in terms of, you know, gender identities. It wasn't a big deal. And the British came. Not that I'm saying it was like easy for every single trans person ever before, and the British, it was a utopia before, and now the British ruined everything. I'm sure it was difficult, but British colonial laws really did disenfranchise trans women. So yeah, nowadays it's very dangerous to be a trans woman, and they face all sorts of discriminations, as they do, in the world globally in general. But over here, it's extremely violent. And so if you're not sort of already psychologically damaged by the fact that, your parents, don't want you in the house anymore, and, you're bringing shame to your family, there's also, the real grave danger for your life where, you can be shot and killed, which is what happened a few months ago to a trans activist. There's another really horrible story that happened in one of the provinces, in a very conservative province in the north, where a trans woman was hacked to pieces and put in a bag. And so, I mean, for the trans community to actually have to hear about these atrocities every single day, and being harassed by the police, being harassed by the public, not having access to education and jobs. Things have changed, I have to say, in 2018. And this is because of a lot of trans women campaigners who have been putting pressure on the government, because of, the injustices are so rife and in your face that you can't ignore them. Because of that, Pakistan did enact a law, the Transgender Persons Act of 2018, that has actually recognized trans people and as citizens. And Pakistan is, I didn't know this, Pakistan is amongst the first nations in the world to actually do that. Other nations actually haven't even acknowledged trans people as citizens.
Wow.
So, in a way, it's like a progressive thing that, Pakistan has done for the trans community. But I think there's also a huge difference between enacting something and then implementing it. So I think trans people still face, a lot of discrimination that needs to be addressed.
Absolutely. I mean, you said they get harassed by the police as well. And I think that's so perverse. Like, isn't in terms of, we all think of police, well, maybe not all, but the police are meant to stand for security, safety, like generally just being there as like a safety net. And I know that's not the case for many people. But that is what they're supposed to stand for. So then actually being directly harassed by them seems so...
Yeah, but I mean, police brutality and harassment against, gender minorities, religious minorities, ethnic minorities, and working class people in general. I think, it happens in the world all over, but it's particularly, rife in sort of more third world countries where the rule of law is thwarted a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's no sort of, it's just a mess.
It's a mess. Yeah. It's a total mess. Yeah.
Yeah. And so we sort of already talked about it a little bit, but just in terms of like women being aware of the oppression that they're under. I mean, we have sort of already talked about this in terms of the importance of education in being aware of your place and like, what actually you're worth, because education, I mean, looking at history, does anyone look at the history and like, does anyone sort of refer to before the military occupation and sort of say, oh, but it was like this before and we were still a Muslim country? What's changed to make it suddenly so much stricter in terms of women's liberation or women's freedom?
I mean, if you talk to sort of university going lecturer type of people who, or journalists or feminist organizations and students, they will talk about that for sure, but the general public won't. And because they don't people don't notice what's happening now. They may have noticed it, at the time in the 80s, but that was like 40 years ago. And so, I think a lot of the time people don't look at history enough in all societies. No one says, like, why are we here today? What policies and what reforms were implemented? People just think, they just react to the now as opposed to why,
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Can we go back a little bit to Aurat March? Can you tell us a little bit more about it, and how was it this year? How much was it supported this year? And was it supported by men and women, or predominantly women?
So I would say, to the last question, predominantly women, but we've had some amazing male allies. The Aurat March took place in 2018. It was very small. 2019, it doubled in size. 2020 was, oh my God. And I'm so glad I was there at the right place at the right time, because this year, obviously, it was not as large, even though I'm very surprised at the turnout. It was, there were crowds out there in different cities. So that was amazing. And it just made me wonder how much larger and greater it would have been had it not been for the pandemic and the COVID crisis. I unfortunately didn't go to this one because, like, the day before the march, I'd been told that I'd come into contact with a COVID positive person. And so I was like, okay, I should probably stay home. And I also live with a father who's in his 70s and he's got diabetes. So I just thought, look, I'll stay away this year. It was a very successful march this year. And the theme for this year's march was women's health in light of the pandemic and in light of, the domestic violence that has surged recently owing to the pandemic. So that was spoken about. A lot of the posters were on that. A lot of the manifesto and the charter of demands of this year's Aurat March was mainly focused on women's health. So that was all good, and all SOPs were followed. However, the backlash for this year's march, honestly, I can't even tell you how horrible and frightening it's been. So last year's march was, there was a lot of backlash that the film covers about how, women's placards had obscenities doctored onto them and really nasty things. And people tried filing a petition to stop the Aurat March, and all sorts of horrible backlash occurred last year. This year, the marchers have been accused of blasphemy. And in a country like Pakistan, that is a very serious, very grave accusation, and that isn't taken lightly. And what happened was a lot of online trolls sort of twisted some of the words on a placard and said, "This insults our holy prophet." And there was also a chant that some women in Karachi were saying. They were saying, I'm going to try and translate it. "We will take back our freedom from the mullahs." The word mullah, that means religious clerics. And someone had wrongly subtitled it saying, "We're going to take it back from Allah." And I know.
Oh
no.
And it's such a grave and serious allegation that has now been disproven by, journalists and these poor women activists who, all they wanted to do was stage a march and talk about their rights. And then they had to present a Twitter storm and a counter narrative to actually, get people to see what they were doing, because, accusations of blasphemy, traditionally has ended so badly. It gives carte blanche to angry mobs, lynching mobs, which has happened. People have actually been lynched because of being wrongly accused of blasphemy. And so if the state doesn't get you, and, the penalty is for blasphemy is death, then vigilantes will. And so that's put a lot of women in very, very dangerous positions. So anyway, these false accusations of blasphemy have actually now sort of come into the mainstream media, and thankfully, a mainstream news channel has actually debunked, what's been said, and said, what a cruelty and injustice and incitement of violence this is for women. And so, it's really exposed the rot in our society and just how low people will stoop in order to silence women.
Given all these, would an average Pakistani woman attend the Aurat March, or would she be frightened of what's to come after? Because this is just very dangerous. It puts your life in a very risky situation. Would they attend?
So when you say average Pakistani woman, once again, we're talking about women who aren't necessarily very literate.
Yeah.
Women who actually experience much more entrenched forms of patriarchy than, say, a privileged woman who's educated would. And so a lot of the times, the attendees at the Aurat March are mostly educated women who, their patriarchs at home aren't as oppressive, and they don't, they're allowed to leave their homes. And I mean, a lot of women aren't, and a lot of even a lot of educated women, their parents will say, no, you can't go. Why are you going to this march that's being discredited, that's man-hating, that's anti-Islam, that's anti-culture? You're not going. And so, I do also know a lot of women who've snuck into the march and told their parents they were going to a friend's or something. So, and so, to actually, I know Aurat March has been doing their best to recruit women from disadvantaged backgrounds to attend the march, and telling them the reasons why, and having a very kind of sort of intersectional approach. And they've been successful on many fronts, but at the same time, you're not going to actually get the average woman to come, because, it has so many more repercussions for her. She might get hit by, her brother for going, or, it's just too
although
much.
Although she knows that she needs to be there, right? She knows that she's oppressed. She knows that, yeah, okay.
Well, I hope so, because, I mean, sometimes there's also a lot of internalized misogyny.
Yes, that's what yes.
Yeah, and at the same time, there's also so much bad press about the Aurat March. So a woman will say, well, I don't want to be associated with these loose liberal women who just, want to wear bikinis, which is so not what we're about. That is like the tiniest little section. That's hardly an issue that we've ever brought up.
Well, that's like that sort of, women only want to get their bodies out. Like they are just, it's still sexualizing women. Absolutely. It's immediately jumping to that, which is again part of the problem.
So so Aurat March has gotten such bad press, and so a lot of women would say something like, "Oh, that doesn't really represent me." And some women are very happy with their husbands, even though, they are oppressed. They just don't, know it. So they'll be like, no, I don't want to rock the boat at home. And yes, I am overworked, but, what is the alternative? And this is it. I'm happy to serve my family. So they might know about the Aurat March. They might, I mean, I can't speak for every woman out there, and it's still a very fresh and new movement. So, I think it still remains to be seen, but it is definitely growing.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you touched on how this year it was a lot to do with the rise in domestic violence and healthcare issues. So talking about healthcare for this year, obviously it seems like it's gotten worse, but in terms of women's healthcare normally and how it's maybe gotten worse, what is their access? How do they have it? Is it sort of there, in terms of just general problems that you might have?
So in my interview with that wonderful older lady, Farida Shahid, she was telling me, this didn't make it into the film, but she was telling me that a friend of hers had come to Pakistan to do fieldwork research on women's health. And she was exploring a particular region. And she said something like, oh, the statistics show that women between the ages of 10 and 45 are very healthy because there's no hospital records of them. And what she completely missed is that they don't send their girls to hospital because it's a waste of money, or, they just don't invest in a girl's healthcare. And so, you'll see more men's records compared to women's. Yeah, I know. So there's that. And then there's, sort of the infant mortality rate over here that disproportionately affects little girls because, they're not going to once again send their little girl to a hospital. She'll get better, hopefully, fingers crossed, at home. And it's not even to do with, hospital records. Sometimes it's even nutrition. They will give their son the bigger piece of chicken compared to their daughter, who, their son is the investment, the daughter is the burden.
Oh my God.
Almost. So there's high infant mortality rates in young girls here. There's also a very high rate of fatalities from breast cancer. Everywhere in the world now we see breast cancer is one amongst the kind of more easy treatable cancers. But in Pakistan, it is left untreated for so long that it becomes irreversible because no one's talking about breast cancer in an open, honest way. Women are embarrassed to talk about their bodies, to actually feel around for lumps and then say, there's a problem, I'm going to go and talk to someone who knows about this. And so it's just left too late. And that's the thing about, things like breast cancer. People sexualize the breast so much, and it's seen as a source of shame to women. And the same thing goes with cervical cancer. It's always left untreated. And so there's such a high mortality rate from that. And then sort of trans women, even though, the law out here, according to that new act, it does say, you can't deny them healthcare. They are denied healthcare a lot. They're turned away from hospitals. They are not given, their due sex reassignment surgeries that, they've saved up for. It's just, So that kind of access to healthcare is,
That seems like something that's such a fundamental right, to deny someone
in 2021
their access to and also the idea that so if the women do find a lump, if they were to discover a lump on their breast, would they then actually be able to go to the hospital to then deal with it?
But would they know that the lump is a form of cancer?
Well, exactly. So, anyone can go to a hospital and say, I have a lump, but the problem is they don't. And there's also not enough, no one speaking about it. And so one of the demands that Aurat March had this year was, educational campaigns based around issues such as breast cancer. Because, people don't know enough about it, aren't willing to speak up about it because it's seen as a source of shame and embarrassment.
This kind of answers the next question about the attitudes to periods and women's specific issues. If these fundamental things are not discussed and not allowed to be, dealt with, then what's the experience for women?
Also about stuff that would make women infertile, stuff like STIs that go untreated. I'm assuming that's...
Yeah, we don't talk about STIs. STIs don't exist over here. And if you want to get tested, it costs a lot. The average Pakistani woman cannot afford a test. And so that puts their genitals and, their insides in a lot of danger, and stuff like HPV that turns into cervical cancer. It's just not a known thing to go for a screening. I mean, healthcare itself over here, it's privatized. And
I was going to ask.
That's,
okay.
Yeah. No, it's privatized. So that's another reason why, women are disadvantaged. If you're a working class person, who are you going to send to the hospital? You're going to send the man in the family. He's the provider. You're going to send your son. He is your future. Your daughter, you're just going to marry her off. She's just So in that sense, yeah, things like STIs, I don't really know. It's not even that common amongst people, from privileged backgrounds over here. We don't talk about it at schools. Absolutely not. So those who can even afford it don't know that, a regular checkup if you're sexually active is crucial. And in terms of periods, sanitary napkins over here, most women over here can't afford them. So a lot of young girls, drop out of school because of the shame and the difficulty in which they have to, deal with menstruating every month. And so girls just, it's a very high percentage of women who drop out. There's also a lack of sanitation over here. And that leads to all sorts of problems for women in terms of their periods and that develop into UTIs and stuff. And so that's one of the other demands that Aurat March has, which is, lower the cost of sanitary towels and have more like awareness campaigns and
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's
fundamentally
I'm sorry, that's just such a lot to take in, because it's one of those things that that's so
we take for granted here. We take these for granted here because all of these are.
We're so privileged. This is not something I've ever. Growing up in London, I've never
dropping
worried
from
about
school,
not having
dropping from school because because of the shame of menstruating. This is
so. But in terms of, go on.
Oh, sorry, your camera lagged. Anyway, I was going to say, it's still, in parts of the UK, it's sort of really difficult for poor girls from disadvantaged backgrounds to afford, pads and stuff. And I think that's also something that does need to be addressed. I think it's still slightly more accessible, but at the same time, it's an issue amongst lots of people from working class communities around the world. And I think Scotland has made them free. Have they not?
Yes,
I think so.
Yes, they have.
Yeah, because it is an issue for women who can't afford it. But in Pakistan, it's much more prevalent.
It seems like I guess here it's more spoken of, and there is more access in terms of those, in terms of access to sanitary towels.
Absolutely.
I just think it's such a right. I just find it such a right to have a life where you have choices and you have agency to make those choices, and the idea that your period gets in the way. It just shows my privilege hugely that I've not had to worry about it. How do you see that? Do you see that it will change? Do you see it changing? Do you see that there are any incremental moves towards more liberation for women through these marches and through the government changing anything?
I think, when we come out with placards talking about women's health, these are real issues, women's safety and their security and their access to education and clean air and all of that. And people change the narrative and say these women are blaspheming. It's very difficult to actually get people to listen to us and our demands. And, at first it was, oh, you guys just want to wear bikinis. And now it's, oh, you guys are, insulting Islam. They're purposefully trying to shift the narrative away from, these very real demands that women over here in this country have. So, what's good is that, it's opened up a dialogue amongst everyone in this society. People are talking about the Aurat March. And I think some people who are sitting on the fence, who aren't necessarily so woman-hating and misogynistic and sort of twisters of the truth, perhaps that will help them change their minds and open their eyes. Who knows? But yeah, if people are going to try and shift the narrative away from what we're talking about, it is going to be a much more difficult climb for us to actually, have these demands heard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And so after the Vice documentary, and you're still pursuing this sort of line of inquiry of looking into women's issues in Pakistan with your documentary, what are you next working on? What's a project that you've got coming up?
I'm in the middle of working on two at the moment. One of them is more time sensitive, and it's very fluffy. And I did it because I was approached to do it, and they said it's only 10 minutes, and I thought, oh, that's fine. It's taken up a lot of time though, but it's still.
I always do.
I know, I was like, how could 10 minutes be so? Yeah, but it's about TikTok in Pakistan, and it's actually really exciting because TikTok. It's such a user-friendly app that anyone can use it. You can be illiterate and be able to, put your content out there to the rest of the world. And I think because of cheaper iPhones nowadays, cheaper smartphones and easier access to internet, a lot of people from, more marginalized communities, working class communities, rural communities, are using TikTok and have actually, gained celebrity status from TikTok. And so and because so many of us are using it, it's 20 million people in Pakistan. That's like 10% of the population using this app. People have sort of like launched themselves into these like celebrity statuses. And these are people from, these are farmers, these are rural workers who aren't literate. These are, young women from very conservative provinces, and this, gender non-conformist people who are, before quite hidden away from, sort of mainstream media outlets are now, in the limelight. And things like Instagram and Twitter and stuff is for, literate people. TikTok has sort of like actually given other people a platform that they would have otherwise been ignored. So that's why I actually, even though I said it was fluffy and annoying, and I'm really happy I'm doing it, and I've learned a lot about TikTok and what it means for Pakistan, and how it's changing people's attitudes towards sort of people from other communities. So there's that. And then there's another one that's taking much longer because I've kind of been neglecting it, but at the same time, it means much more to me. It's about child labor in Pakistan. It follows a particular case of this young 8-year-old girl who was murdered by her employees because she accidentally freed one of their exotic birds. I'm not making this up. It's just, so I'm following this particular case and talking to her family and the lawyers who are working to put these employees behind bars for good. But at the same time, it draws on issues of other things like our laws, our labor laws, what it means to be a child in Pakistan. So that's what I'm working on as well.
Your work is so important because you're just exposing the problem to a very wider range of people that wouldn't have a clue of what's happening. Have you ever felt fear? because you're going against the system.
Yeah. My dad constantly fears for me. I feel like he's this anxious man who also like is trying his best to stop me from pursuing what I want to do. Whoops, I moved my table. Only because he's so worried, and rightly so. It is very worrying out here, and it's actually a very dangerous country for journalists out here. So at the same time, I do try and cover a lot of my bases, and there are some things topics I just don't touch upon, even though I think it would be very brave if I did, hopefully one day maybe. But these days, just because I'm starting out, I don't touch upon certain things. So it is dangerous. But yeah, so far I haven't really felt that unsafe, thankfully.
That's great.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, thank you so much for all of that. And I think as our platform, I think on Women Who Fight, it feels like this is exactly the kind of thing we want to learn about ourselves and help other people learn about. Because as we've learned in this podcast, I have a lot of privilege when it comes to we all do about those basic, what we expect to be like having like sanitary towels, just no brainer. All of these things, which are just no brainers, which even people, as you say, in the UK don't have enough of.
And it's admirable that, Olivia, you're there, because you were here. You experienced the complete opposite, end of the spectrum, and you said, no, I'm going to go back and I'm going to make a wave. I'm going to change things. So this is something to feel very, very proud of. Can we close with the standard question that we ask everybody? What are you fighting for?
Sure. So my fight is to give a platform to the voices of marginalized and oppressed people, be they women, children, rural folk, working class people. And I hope that through my documentaries, I can help them in any way with their struggle. That's it.
Thank you so much. That was very well put. Just envelope that.
You're an inspiration, Olivia. An inspiration.
Thank you. I really love what you guys do as well.
Thank you so much for your time as well.
Yeah.
We know how busy you are.
Thank you so much. Changing the world.